The book I'll be talking about is Perfect Chaos by Linnea and Cinda Johnson, and it's about a daughter, Linnea, and her mother, Cinda, who are discussing how bipolar affects the family and the struggles and the challenges that come along with it. I guess, in a sense, you could look at this as a case study. It was longitudinal because this happened to her over a couple years, which I guess is a strength because you get to see how the illness really changes over time. But you can't really test anything with an illness like this. So you can't replicate her story. The two big ideas that I would pick out from this book would be patterns of bipolar disorder and the effects on the family. And I'll start with the patterns of bipolar first. I was initially intrigued in this book because somebody in my family, my brother, struggles from bipolar disorder as well. And while I was reading, I noticed that he seemed to follow a very similar pattern to the one that Linnea was following. It kind of seemed to go a little bit like it's hard to recognize it as a illness at first. Then there's one bump in the road where you're like, okay, maybe this is just growing up. And then the family's in shock and they start to recover with like medications because they're like, okay, maybe this will get them back on track. And then college bound, because these websites that I looked up, I'll talk about that in a second, but it talked about how a lot of people who suffer from this experience it in their late teens or just before 25 years old. So college bound makes sense. But then there's a worsening setback, and then the family finally begins to recognize, okay, this is something serious. And then there's turmoil, emotional, physical even, and then they get helps, and then it's just a series of ups and downs because you're like, okay, they're getting better, and then there's another episode, is what they call it, which I'll explain in a little bit, and then it just kind of goes back and forth, and then in the end, you kind of come to a stable, mostly stable, because you're still going to have your ups and downs, just not as severe. And that's kind of the pattern it seemed to follow throughout this book in a vague sense, as well as in my life, what we've seen with my brother. And it was very easy to assign characters from her family to my family. Like, I would look at Linnea and I'm like, okay, that's Ryan. And then I would look at the sister and I'm like, that's me. And the dad was my dad and the mom was my mom. It matched up so perfectly. And I was like, it figured that maybe this pattern was likely to be the case for many families who deal with somebody who has bipolar. So I looked up the symptoms for further clarification to see if, maybe the symptoms are the reason why this pattern is so common. There are two sites that had performed research about this illness and kind of told me about the symptoms. One was the Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Services of the Board of Cuyahoga County, and the second was the National Institute of Mental Health. One of the first points they made was that bipolar disorder often develops in a person's late teens or early adult years. At least half of all cases start before the age of 25. And I already mentioned that they seem to follow that exact pattern. And I think with Linnea it was her freshman year, and with my brother it was kind of his sophomore year, but mostly going into junior year. And freshman, sophomore year for both of them, at the time, just like you were unable to recognize it as maybe becoming something worse than what it already was. And that's why when they got into their later years of high school, junior, senior year, it became more prominent and they ended up getting help. And, then it started to follow that pattern where it just got worse and worse. Second was that it's not easy to spot when it starts because the symptoms may seem like separate problems, not recognized as parts of a larger problem. And some people can suffer for years without being properly diagnosed and treated. In the book, Cinda was always thinking, she was always passing it off as just general anxiety. And my family was doing the same thing. I mean, he's going off into his senior year, it's senior anxiety, senioritis. People get that all the time. And they blame other things, like with Linnea, it was juggling music, sports, her social life. And then with my brother, it was the stress of senior year, when those factors probably played in a little bit. But it's just a very bad time for something like that to be developing because you can't distinguish between the two. Like growing up or an illness. It's very hard to distinguish at the beginning. A third thing they said was that the person may not feel that anything is wrong, even as family and friends recognize the mood swings as possible bipolar disorder. And then it started talking about mood episodes. which a manic episode is overly joyful or excited state of mind, and extremely sad or hopeless is a depressive episode, and then you can have a mixed state, which is a little bit of both. Both these sites found that they don't understand why people who suffer from bipolar disorder participate in substance abuse. And I mean, just from reading the book and like experiences in my family, I think, if I were to say, I think that sometimes they want to come off the pills because they start feeling okay, and they're like, well, I feel fine. I don't have this illness. There was something that happened a couple weeks ago where my brother was like, there's nothing wrong. I don't know why I'm taking these. I want to come off. And I think we're kind of still going through that. I don't really know everything. But sometimes the pills can make you feel flat or dull, and sometimes you can feel like you're high. And that may be why some people choose to self-medicate, with alcohol or drugs, because they're sick of the way the pills make them feel. Or they get into substance abuse before even figuring out they have an illness, because they're trying to keep those feelings of darkness at bay, which is very true reading this book. My take on it is that those two reasons are probably why they choose to abuse substances. A fifth fact was that symptoms often include agitation or trouble sleeping, which with Linnea was the case a lot. She complained about how she would have so many thoughts going through her mind, even when she was in her yoga class, that she was just so agitated. And in the middle of the instructor talking about how it's so great to be at peace of mind, she was like, I just missed half the speech because there were so many thoughts running in my head, and that's agitation. And that happened to her all the time. And like an example of, with my brother, we were just up north over winter break, and we go up north because he's really good at snowboarding. 11 years of hockey, and then he just picks up snowboarding and is like a professional in 2 days, which is fine. It was the second night there or something, and he was the only one, no one else in our family can snowboard, so he was doing it by himself, which he usually likes. But then I think he hit like one of those mixed states, maybe more towards the depressive side, where he was kind of just laying on the bed and he was like, I want to go home. We're like, why? And he goes, because I don't want to be here, I'm always by myself, there's nothing to do. We're like, Ryan, there's so much to do, we're at a resort. And he just was so stressed about who knows what, but he couldn't sleep. And that, it happens so often, it's crazy. But the thing is, these may seem like fairly normal symptoms, which is part of the reason why it is hard to recognize as a major illness. And it's probably kind of weird to say, but it actually was somewhat reassuring to learn from these mental health institutes that it is hard to recognize this in the beginning. Because, maybe it helps relieve some guilt from our family and Linnea's family for thinking that we overlooked something or we were not noticing the signs. And I'll get into that a little more when I go into the family portion of this. Other thing said was that people with bipolar disorder may also have behavioral problems, abusing alcohol or substances, having relationship problems. And in the book, Linnea had a crush on this guy for all throughout high school because he was like the perfect dude. And he really was a great dude. He saved her life at one point. And so relationship problems. And then she was trying all kinds of drugs, and she was going to parties each weekend, hooking up with random boys, relationship problems, and drinking a bunch. And with my brother, he was always, I remember senior year, when he was really distant from our family, we just blamed that on him being senior year. He wants to have good times with his friends. We're going to let him do that, but it kind of sucked. He was partying literally each weekend. And then he moved into the basement. So when his friends came over, they could smoke pot in private and stuff, and he would go out all the time. And again, we just thought he was hanging out with his friends, but it was much worse than that. And then I was looking up, it also told us 4 or 5 different kinds of bipolar disorder, which that's a lot. No wonder it's so hard to diagnose people. And 5 different types of bipolar disorder explains why it takes so long, and you have to monitor them so you can get them on the correct medications. Linnea was going between lithium and then Prozac, and it made you react differently. Each person reacts differently, and then the person who has the disorder cannot always understand why they're feeling what they feel, and they can describe it and it can sound like one thing, but in reality it's another thing. So it takes a really, really long time. And the worst part is that you have to wait 6 to 8 weeks sometimes for the medicine to kick in. And during that time, they're like, it's not working. This is a waste of time. I hate this. And it's just like, it's very hard to deal with that as you're waiting for something to get better. You just keep hoping each day. You're like, today it'll work. Today it'll work. And then when it finally does work, you're like, thank God we finally found it. But if it still doesn't work, then going back and starting all over, that's hard on the family. But yeah, 5 different types. That's difficult. It said anxiety disorders like PTSD and social phobia can co-occur with this. I wouldn't call it PTSD necessarily, but Linnea said that she always felt some kind of connection with her uncle, who, I mean, he had like a great life apparently from what all 3 of them say. And he was like going pro on basketball, and he just somehow broke his legs in the accident. And what they're assuming is that he killed himself because he crashed the car, but he was also shot. And like, what do you think happened? That's probably why he crashed the car. I wouldn't call that PTSD, but that's definitely something that stuck with her. And that probably wasn't the trigger, but when she was going through, she probably was making subconscious connections back to that. And maybe like in her freshman year, her friend started cutting herself, and she was asking her mom, what should I do? I need to tell somebody. And mom was like, tell the counselor. The counselor's supposed to keep it confidential between you and her and the person who's struggling. And the counselor went and told all her parents, and then the friend got mad at Linnea, and that Linnea, thinking back, thinks that was probably an initiation to why it started. I mean, and then of course other factors played. I should probably mention my brother's friend, who like a month after my brother found out about his illness and had been home, his friend was hospitalized for the same illness, and that was very hard on him, and so probably wasn't helpful. But yeah, if we're thinking about how it tends to run in families, we can think back to Linnea's Uncle Steve. And I was talking with my mom about, well, she kind of argued with me that little stuff as a child that we thought was normal may not actually have been normal, and once we got older, it could have worsened. Like, Linnea was very oversensitive with her friends, I guess, and she said she noticed little things with Ryan. But like, he says that a lot of people who develop bipolar disorder can be oversensitive, and a lot of what my brother had may have developed into this worsening thing. So maybe there was something with our Uncle Steve and my mom's brother and my grandma's brother, as he killed himself as well. And then my cousin, he actually had depression for 2 years, but he got like books about depression, figured out how to work his way through it, and did it himself without his parents ever knowing, which it's like, that's crazy to me. And also said that most people with bipolar disorder had missed work because of their illness, which wasn't really the case with either my brother or Linnea. It was kind of impressive what they both did, because they maintained really good grades with all the other stuff while going through these problems. But alcohol and substance abuse, talked about that. Panic disorders, Linnea experienced that. Been treated or hospitalized, both of them had, multiple times. Well, her once, my brother a couple times. And then said there were certain traits that also appeared to run in families, such as obsessive compulsive disorder, which is my dad. Once again, this was the Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Services of the Board of Cuyahoga County and National Institute of Mental Health. And they really clarified a lot of these things, showed me all the symptoms, and that really helped to clarify the patterns that people with bipolar disorder seem to follow, and it explained a lot. The next thing I'm going to get into is the effects on family. These are the effects on the families, and I took like 1,000 notes throughout reading this book, and I looked up some general or some common effects on the family that result from bipolar disorder. And the Mood Disorders Association of BC, they listed a couple. The first one was that emotional distress such as guilt, grief, and worry come into play. And that was like, I took notes on this, and it was like the family was always questioning, or the parents were always questioning, is it my fault? Did I push my daughter too hard, or did I push my son too hard? Could I have noticed these signs and possibly prevented anything from happening? And during those ups times, when I was going between the ups and the downs, or after that first initial shock to the family, where it's like the discovery of Linnea's depression and Ryan's drug use, that there was always an underlying feeling that something worse was to come. So that would be the worrying, the guilt and the worrying and stuff. The second thing they mentioned was that there's a disruption in regular routines. And I remember that my mom took a few weeks off from work once he came home from the hospital the first time because she didn't want to leave him alone. I think for like the first week she wasn't supposed to leave him alone, but then she could have, but she still stayed. And then Linnea mom also adjusted her schedule, and her dad too, so that they could go to the hospital and stuff. Having to deal with unusual or dangerous behavior, couldn't leave him alone in case, he attempted suicide again. And with Linnea, she was on 24/7 watch with a nurse at the hospital. And the parents, they were there more often before they had the 24/7 watch. And then once they put that on, the parents were able to kind of go back into more of a regular routine because they didn't have to be there as often, since they knew that she was like being watched in case anything happened. Financial stresses as a result of reduced income or excessive spending. It's not mentioned in the book, but I'm assuming they probably had a similar case to Ryan, because when he was pulled out of his first semester of college, we still had thousands of dollars to pay that the first semester off, but we still had to pay the second semester because we committed to a year. So it was something weird like that, but we owed a lot. We still would have owed anyway, but we were also doing hospital expenses and all that stuff. It says strained marital or family relationships. And I noticed this a lot, and I was talking to my mom yesterday. I kind of interviewed my mom about all these things that I took notes on. She gave me a lot of good answers, and that kind of helped me format this. But throughout the book, I noticed that Linnea's parents were constantly working together. If there was a problem, they faced them head on together, and they never really divided. I mean, they had their own stresses, of course, but they were both stressing at the same time, so they would come together. My mom said that my dad and her kind of kept each other balanced. One was like, we have to do this to fix him. The other would be like, we need to calm down, let the doctor do it. It's just kind of, if one went too high, the other would bring him back down, But it did make my dad's stresses worse. I guess all of ours. It was probably a cause for his OCD-like behavior. And I don't throw that word around lightly. That's just the reality of the situation. That's how many of the symptoms of OCD he demonstrates. And I pulled a quote from my mom. She said, "We were never divided when it came to Rye. We were divided when it came to your dad." And his behavior was a result of Ryan. Changes in family roles. They kind of remain the same with Linnea's family. They had the same jobs to their daughter. The mom had a more prominent role, but she always had. And they had the same jobs within the households, too. But here, during that time, my dad took on all the jobs. Doing the laundry, cooking, cleaning, shopping, all of which my mom had done before. I mean, they both did it, but he took them over completely. We think because he's a man who's always moving, he's literally non-stop moving or talking. He does so much. We think he feels the need to stay busy to keep himself from worrying. And it's not necessarily the case anymore, but he practiced it so much it became a habit. Difficulty in maintaining relationships outside the family. In the book, the outside family wasn't mentioned a whole lot because they were so involved with Linnea. They did mention how people would come to visit. They brought their babies. Their oldest daughter's friend even came with her new baby. And the grandparents, they stayed in touch. They never came down to visit, though, because the grandpa was so worried that the grandma was like, "You're going to freak her out. You need to just calm it down." They knew about Linnea, not to the extent that the immediate family did, but they knew some. And I remember with my brother, our Uncle Mark stopped by a few times because he wanted to drop stuff off for my brother or just come talk to him and stuff. And my Uncle Ray, when my parents went off to visit my brother in the hospital a couple times, he would text and ask if he wanted to, or if I wanted him to bring me dinner, or if I wanted to go there for dinner, just hang out with him. I said no all the times, but he was always there, And in an odd way, it kind of brought the family together to some extent, even though our family very vaguely knew about what was going on. It says health problems as a result of stress. And I think that we all have some anxieties to a certain extent, but not all have anxiety disorder. I think it's very likely that those anxieties became more prominent or worsened a little bit as a result of the situations that we were going through. So those are all the effects on the family that I noticed throughout the book, and that were also validated by this Mood Disorders Association. Overall, I know we're supposed to discuss remaining questions or ideas for further research. I know I'm supposed to have this, but honestly, I have a ton of questions, because having been part of a family who experienced a member go through this, you find that the little bit you thought you knew about these things is nothing compared to how it is in reality. It's kind of guesswork on your family's part, because it's a unique situation to each family. So the family has to personally figure out how to deal with it. And stuff that you find online, or information that I look up, or questions that I might want to answer, they can be answered, maybe not answered to the extent that I need it. So that's why it's a very personal thing to a family to try to figure it out on their own. I feel like I'm learning quite a bit about the illness, like living with somebody who has it. So I didn't really have a whole lot of questions. These sites just provided a clear explanation for why people with bipolar disorder seem to follow these patterns. It's about as much as I need to know, because of the rest I'm experiencing with my family. I did enjoy this book. The fact that I'm now more aware of everything else. Like, even in the book, when they were at the hospital, the mother was like, you kind of stop having these misconceptions about people. Like the guy who talks to himself. She ended up feeling comfortable when he was around Linnea, because people were acting too weird, he'd tell them to go away. And it's just like, you just look around and you see people who you normally probably would have judged, and you're like, you don't think the same way at all, because they're just people. And they're not as lucky as some, because they don't have family that come to see them. And then you just kind of feel grateful for what you do have. It just gives you a new perspective, I guess, on life and people in general. So yeah, Perfect Chaos.